Marcus Jenkins walked slowly down the narrow aisle of the airplane, feeling with every fiber of his being the unbearable fatigue of the past 72 hours. His shoulders, usually straight and tense, now slumped slightly under the weight of duty accomplished. The completion of the Detroit Ripper case had come at the cost of countless sleepless nights, liters of coffee and nerve cells that never seemed to recover. Glancing at the ticket in his hand, he checked the number. 23rd row, window seat. At last, he would be able to lean against the porthole and maybe get some sleep on the flight to Washington. The FBI director had called him personally to report on the case, but that could wait until tomorrow morning. Right now, Marcus wanted only one thing: silence. Finding his row, he carefully placed the small travel bag on the top shelf and lowered himself into the seat. The airplane gradually filled with passengers, people of different ages, professions, and stories, united only by their destination. Marcus covered his eyes, letting the hum of voices become a distant background noise. "Excuse me, this is my seat." A woman's voice, harsh and demanding, snapped the agent out of his brief oblivion. Marcus opened his eyes and saw before him a woman in her 50s wearing an elegant cream-colored business suit. Her blonde hair was gathered into a perfect bun, and her face expressed impatience and slight irritation. "I beg your pardon?" Marcus asked calmly, pulling out his ticket. "I'm in seat 23A. The woman pressed her lips together and held out her boarding pass. "I'm Karen Baker, and I'm in seat 23B. That means I'll have to sit next to—" she stammered, glancing around. Glancing at the— she stammered, giving Marcus an appraising look. "With you." Marcus nodded, showing no emotion. 15 years in the FBI had taught him not to react to such stares. He moved slightly, allowing Karen to pass to her seat. "No, no, no, no," the woman suddenly exclaimed, taking a step back. "That won't do. I always fly business class. There must be some kind of mistake." She looked around for a flight attendant, sighing loudly and muttering something to herself about the competence of modern airline personnel. Her gaze stopped on a young female flight attendant who was helping an elderly couple place their carry-on luggage. "Young lady, yes, you, come here, please." The stewardess apologized to the elderly couple and made her way over to Karen. Her name tag said, Diana Rodriguez. "What can I do for you?" she asked with a professional smile. "There's been a terrible mistake," Karen began with a theatrical wave of her hand. "They put me in economy class. I always fly business, always. Please check my reservation, Karen Baker." Diana politely took the boarding pass from the woman's hands and studied it carefully. "Miss Baker, according to your ticket, you do have an economy seat, 23B. If you wanted a business class seat, you should have indicated that when you made your reservation." "Yes, I understand, but—" Karen looked back at Marcus, who was staring out the window, trying not to interfere with the conversation. "Look, I can't sit here. Yeah, I'm claustrophobic. I need more space." Diana nodded sympathetically, but her gaze remained firm. "I understand your concern, but unfortunately today's flight is fully booked. We have no seats available in business class." "Then put me somewhere in economy class," Karen insisted, her voice growing louder. "I can't sit next to him." Marcus felt his shoulders tense. He slowly turned his head and met Karen's gaze. Her eyes were instantly drawn away, but the contempt flashed in them was impossible to miss. "Ma'am, as I said, the flight is fully booked," Diana repeated, her professional smile tightening slightly. "All seats are taken." By now, several passengers had already noticed the conversation. Among them was a middle-aged man with thin-rimmed glasses, who was watching with undisguised interest. He was holding a notebook in his hand, which he opened from time to make short notes. "This is just outrageous!" Karen's voice rose another octave. "I'm a regular customer of your airline. I spend thousands of dollars on your services every year. And this is how you treat me?" Marcus took a deep breath. He knew this type of person all too well. People who believe the world revolves around them and their comfort. People for whom other people's rights and dignity were nothing. "Ma'am," he turned to Karen, his voice quiet but confident, "I understand your concern, but the plane will be taking off soon. Perhaps I should take your seat so as not to delay the flight?" Karen turned sharply toward him, her face contorted with indignation. "And you? Could you give me a window seat?" she asked, putting on a fake smile. It would help me with my claustrophobia if I could look out. Marcus thought for a moment. He really wanted to lean against the window and sleep, but if that would solve the problem... Of course, he replied, starting to rise. No, no, Karen stopped him abruptly. I mean, maybe you could look somewhere else? Somewhere away? Her true intentions became obvious not only to Marcus, but also to Diana and a few of the closest passengers. An awkward silence hung in the air. Ma'am, Diana tried to diffuse the situation. As I explained, all the seats are taken. If you are not comfortable with your current accommodations, we can offer you a seat on the next flight, which leaves in 3 hours. 3 hours? Karen exclaimed. That's unacceptable. I have an important meeting in Washington tonight. Marcus noticed that the man with the notepad was now openly recording everything that was happening. A journalist? A writer? Either way, the situation was becoming more and more public, and that was the last thing the tired FBI agent wanted. Ma'am, Marcus tried to intervene again, I really don't mind giving you the window seat. It's not a problem. That's not what I'm talking about, Karen cut him off, no longer hiding her irritation. I prefer to sit next to someone else. Diana tensed, her smile disappearing completely. Miss Baker, she said in an official tone, our airline does not tolerate discrimination in any form. If you have a problem with your accommodations based on prejudice, I must remind you of our rules. Prejudice? Karen was outraged. How dare you? I just want a comfortable flight. It's my right as a customer. By now the aisle was partially blocked, and the other passengers were getting impatient. Some were glancing around unhappily. Others were openly criticizing Karen's behavior. Lady, take your seat already, shouted someone from the back row. We all want to take off on time, supported another voice. Karen turned around, looking around the cabin for support, but only cold stares and disapproving expressions. The man with the notebook raised his hand, drawing attention. Excuse me, he said to Karen. Richard Lee, Detroit Times. Could you please explain why this gentleman's presence bothers you so much? Karen turned pale. It was one thing to make a scene on an airplane, but it was quite another to find herself in the pages of a newspaper as the instigator of a racist scandal. Yeah, You've got it all wrong, she began to stammer. I've just had a rough day and I really prefer the window seat. Marcus stood up, his tall figure now towering over Karen. Please, he said calmly, pointing to his seat. Take the window seat. I don't mind at all. Karen hesitated, clearly caught off guard by the gesture. She looked from Marcus to Diana, then to the journalist, and finally to the impatient passengers still waiting to get on. Yeah, thank you, she mumbled, reluctantly slipping past Marcus and taking a seat by the window. Marcus sat down next to her, keeping a neutral expression on his face. Diana nodded gratefully at him and continued her duties, helping the other passengers to settle in. Richard Lee, the journalist, made a few more notes in his notebook before heading to his seat a few rows further down. Karen sat with her back tensely straightened, carefully turning away from the window and pretending to study the runway. But her restless fingers, tapping nervously on the armrest, gave away her inner state. Marcus closed his eyes, trying to return to the state of calm he'd had before Karen appeared. But the silence between them was filled with unspoken tension, and he knew this was only the beginning of a very long flight. Across the aisle from them, an elderly couple were whispering, casting disapproving glances in Karen's direction. The word racist came up clearly several times in their conversation, loud enough for Karen to hear. I'm not a racist, she said suddenly, addressing Marcus, but loud enough for others to hear. I have colleagues of your nationality. I simply prefer a certain comfort during the flight. Marcus didn't open his eyes and didn't respond. He had learned to pick his battles, and this one wasn't worth his energy. The plane pulled away from the runway, rising into the gray Detroit sky. Marcus felt the familiar pressure in his ears and mechanically swallowed, equalizing it. He'd had to fly so often during his years with the FBI that all the airports in the country sometimes blended into one blurry memory. Now, however, this flight promised to be unforgettable, and not at all in a positive way. Karen Baker remained seated, defiantly turned away from the porthole. Her tense posture and tight lips indicated that the landing incident was not over. Marcus sensed it with all his professional experience. The collision was just beginning. As the plane reached cruising altitude and the seatbelt indicator light went off, Diana Rodriguez began serving drinks. Her brown eyes lingered on row 23 for a moment, as if assessing the situation, and she headed in their direction. "Something to drink?" she asked with a professional smile. "Water, please," Marcus replied. Karen turned away from the window, giving the stewardess a haughty look. "Do you have a decent brand of champagne?" she asked in a tone that implied a negative answer. "In economy class, we offer white or red wine, beer, soft drinks, and water," Diana explained patiently. "Of course," Karen snorted. "No service. White wine, then. Is it chilled at least?" Diana handed her a glass of wine with icy politeness and handed Marcus a bottle of water. Marcus nodded gratefully, noting the young woman's professionalism. Taking a sip of the wine, Karen grimaced. "Terrible," she said loudly. "As to be expected." Marcus remained silent, taking a sip of water. He was used to tense situations, interrogating criminals, negotiating with hostages, coordinating special operations. Sitting next to a disgruntled female passenger was not the most challenging experience of his life. Nevertheless, he could feel the fatigue of a completed case being compounded by irritation. He closed his eyes, trying to focus on his breathing. It was at this point that Karen decided to break the silence. "I don't understand why people like you are seated next to business travelers," she said loud enough for those sitting next to her to hear. "It doesn't make good business sense for the airline." Marcus slowly opened his eyes and turned to her. His gaze was calm but attentive, the kind of gaze he used when evaluating suspects. "Like me?" he asked quietly. "Well, you know," she waved her hand uncertainly. "People from outside the business." "And how did you define non-business for me?" Marcus asked, his voice steady despite his growing irritation. Karen glanced around nervously, as if seeking support from the other passengers, but most of them pretended not to hear the conversation. Only Richard Lee, the journalist, made no secret of his interest, leaning forward from his seat. "Well, your clothes, for example," she finally answered. "A plain t-shirt and jeans. Business people don't dress like that for flying." Marcus lowered his gaze to his t-shirt, black, unmarked, and dark blue jeans. Clean, neat, comfortable clothes he'd chosen after 72 hours in a formal suit while completing an operation. "Perhaps business people have days when they prefer comfort," he observed. "And these yours?" She nodded at his hands. "Tattoos. That's not the way to do it in serious business." Marcus looked at his wrists. The right one had a small tattoo, the date he'd joined the FBI. On the left was the badge number of his partner, killed in the line of duty 3 years ago. They weren't flashy or flashy, just thin lines of numbers that had deep personal meaning to him. "Appearances can be deceiving," he said, a phrase he often repeated to young agents in training. At that moment, a voice from the next row intervened, an older man who had been silently watching the events unfold. "Ma'am," he said to Karen, "I don't think you have the right to judge this gentleman by his appearance. It's not nice, and it's not polite." "I didn't ask for your opinion," Karen snapped, but there was uncertainty in her voice. On the other side of the aisle, a young woman with a child shook her head disapprovingly. "Some people just don't know how to behave in public," she whispered loudly to her son, clearly referring to Karen. The situation was beginning to attract more and more attention. Several passengers were already openly observing what was happening in row 23. Richard Lee continued to take notes, his fingers moving quickly over the keyboard of his smartphone. Karen noticed the growing interest in their conversation and nervously adjusted the collar of her blouse. Instead of lowering her tone, however, she seemed determined to go all in. "I'm just expressing what a lot of people think but are afraid to say," she said louder. "Why should I feel uncomfortable on a flight for which I paid a considerable sum? Because your comfort is no more important than the comfort of other passengers," Marcus replied calmly. "We all paid for our tickets." "Don't compare," Karen snorted. "People like you usually fly economy class. Your ticket was probably only enough for half of my shoes." This blatantly dismissive phrase caused an indignant murmur among the passengers who heard it. Diana Rodriguez, passing by with a tray, stopped when she heard Karen's last words. "Miss Baker," she said in a formal tone, "I'm going to have to ask you to watch what you say. I remind you that our airline policy prohibits any form of discrimination on board." "Discrimination?" Karen was indignant. "I'm just expressing my opinion. It's a free country, isn't it?" "Freedom of speech doesn't mean freedom from consequences," said Richard Lee, suddenly joining the conversation, "especially when your words clearly violate airline policy and common courtesy." Karen turned sharply to the journalist. "And who are you? The self-proclaimed arbiter of morality?" Her voice shook with rage. "Maybe you're one of them too?" The word "them" sounded so contemptuous that even the most patient passengers could no longer ignore the blatant racism in her remarks. Marcus straightened in his chair. Years of training had taught him to control his emotions, but now he could feel his patience thinning with every passing second. Not because of the insults directed at him. He'd gotten used to them back at the police academy. It was the escalation of the conflict, which could affect the safety of the entire flight. "Ma'am," he said to Karen, his voice quiet but steeled, "I suggest you calm down and spend the rest of the flight in silence. It will be better for everyone." Karen seemed to be just waiting for that, her face contorted into a nasty grin. "Are you threatening me?" she exclaimed, deliberately raising her voice. "Did you hear that? He's threatening me." Diana Rodriguez, assessing the situation, quickly walked to the front of the plane and picked up the service phone. After a brief conversation, she returned, and shortly thereafter, a tall, gray-haired man in a captain's uniform emerged from the cockpit. Michael Thompson had the look of a man who had seen every possible situation in his long career as a pilot. His calm face, with wrinkles in the corners of his eyes, radiated confidence and authority. He approached the 23rd row, where the tension had reached an almost palpable level. "Good afternoon," he said. "I'm Michael Thompson, captain of this flight. I've been informed of some disturbance here. May I ask what the problem is?" Karen instantly assumed a look of insulted innocence. "Oh, Captain, I'm so glad you came," she began, her voice suddenly soft and trembling. "This gentleman made a threatening remark to me, and I feel very unsafe." Marcus shook his head slightly, not believing his ears. He had encountered the most sophisticated liars in his career, but rarely one who could change tactics so quickly. "Sir?" Captain Thompson turned to Marcus. "I suggested that Miss Baker spend the rest of the flight in silence because her comments were making many passengers uncomfortable," Marcus explained calmly. "He's lying," Karen exclaimed. "He said that if I didn't shut up, I'd regret it." Several passengers seated close enough to hear their conversation simultaneously disagreed. "That's not true," exclaimed a woman with a child. "This lady has been making racist remarks the entire flight, and the gentleman just kept his cool." "He didn't say a word about her being sorry," confirmed an elderly man from a neighboring row. Richard Lee raised his hand, drawing the captain's attention. "I have an audio recording of the last 15 minutes, he announced. "I'm a journalist, and I started recording when the situation became tense, out of professional habit." Captain Thompson listened intently to everyone and turned to Karen, whose face was now pale with the realization that her lie hadn't worked. "Miss Baker," the captain said in a serious tone, "aboard my aircraft. I am responsible not only for the safety of the flight, but for the well-being of all passengers. I will not tolerate behavior that violates the comfort or dignity of anyone." "But I didn't do anything!" Karen tried to defend herself. "It's just a misunderstanding." "According to the testimony of several passengers and a crew member, you repeatedly made inappropriate remarks with racist overtones," the captain continued. "This is a direct violation of our airline's policy." Karen changed tactics, her eyes suddenly filling with tears. "I didn't mean to offend anyone," she said in a shaky voice. "I'm just tired. I've had a hard day. I'm not racist. I have friends of all races and nationalities." Marcus mentally added this phrase to his personal list of what people say when they are accused of racism. This phrase was invariably at the top of the list. Captain Thompson, however, remained adamant. "Miss Baker, you have two choices," he said. You can sincerely apologize to this gentleman and any passengers who were disturbed by your behavior and spend the rest of the flight in complete silence. Or, if you cannot guarantee compliance with the rules of behavior on board, we will be forced to disembark you at the earliest possible opportunity at Cleveland Airport, where we have a short technical stop scheduled. Karen's face turned crimson with humiliation. She looked around the cabin where most of the passengers were now openly watching the drama unfold. Some were even filming the action on their phones. "You can't do this to me!" Karen's voice rose to a shout again. "I know my rights. I'm friends with the president of your airline. One word from me and you all lose your jobs." Captain Thompson remained unfazed upon hearing this threat. In his 30 years in aviation, he had met many passengers who claimed to know the management. "In that case," he replied calmly, "I will notify air traffic control to prepare documents for your disembarkation in Cleveland. Airport security personnel will be waiting at the ramp." "What?" Karen gasped in indignation. "You can't! It's because of him!" She pointed a trembling finger at Marcus. "He's the one who should be dropped off! He's aggressive and dangerous!" This latest attempt to turn the situation around caused a wave of outrage among the passengers, many of whom were now openly shouting their disagreement. "This gentleman has not uttered a single rude word," remarked the captain. "Unlike you, Miss Baker." At that moment, the airplane shook slightly as they entered the turbulence zone. The seatbelt indicator light came back on and the co-pilot's voice echoed through the cabin, asking the passengers to return to their seats and buckle up. "I need to get back to the cockpit," said Captain Thompson. "Miss Baker, I'm giving you one last chance. Apologize and keep quiet for the rest of the flight, or prepare to disembark in Cleveland." Karen sat with her lips pressed into a thin line. Her gaze darted between the captain, Marcus, and the watching passengers. Finally, she squeezed out, "Okay, apologize, if anyone misunderstood my words." That apology with the caveat elicited a few disapproving cheers, but Captain Thompson decided that was enough, at least for the moment. "Very well," he nodded. "Diana will monitor the situation. If there is the slightest infraction of the rules, the decision on your disembarkation will be made immediately." With those words, the captain returned to the cockpit, and Diana took a position near the 23rd row, watching carefully. Karen sat with her arms crossed over her chest, her face a mixture of humiliation and rage. She cast a leering glance at Marcus and hissed quietly enough for only him to hear, "You're going to regret this. I'm not the type to be treated like this." Marcus didn't answer. He just stared straight ahead, his face expressing nothing but the infinite patience of a man accustomed to dealing with the most difficult members of humanity. But a premonition was growing within him that this incident was far from over. The turbulence increased and the plane shook again, this time more violently. Richard Lee, putting his cell phone away, glanced meaningfully at Marcus, as if trying to convey some kind of message. Marcus nodded faintly. Years in law enforcement had taught him how to recognize allies. At that moment, Karen, as if making some kind of decision, raised her hand sharply, beckoning Diana over. "I want to talk to the captain," she said as the stewardess approached. "Immediately." Diana Rodriguez paused professionally, looking at Karen Baker with barely perceptible tension in her eyes. "The captain is busy controlling the airplane, especially in a turbulence zone," she replied in an even voice. "I can give him your message when it's appropriate." "No, I want to talk to him now," Karen insisted, her voice shaking with ill-contained rage. "This is a matter of flight safety." The last words caused several passengers to turn around anxiously. The mention of safety on board an airplane was always a cause for concern. Diana cast a quick glance at Marcus, who continued to remain unfazed, though his dark eyes were watching the situation closely. Years in law enforcement had taught him to recognize the moment when a verbal confrontation was ready to escalate into something more serious. "I'll contact the cockpit," Diana finally agreed, realizing that refusal could only make things worse. She went to the office phone, spoke quietly, then returned. "Captain Thompson will listen to you after we pass the turbulence zone," she said. "Please remain in your seat with your seatbelt fastened." Karen gripped the armrests with such force that her manicured fingernails, covered with a flawless manicure, turned white with tension. She cast a leering glance at Marcus. "This is all because of you," she said through gritted teeth. "You put on this show on purpose to humiliate me." Marcus turned to her, his face calm, but there was a steely glint in his eyes that was usually reserved for the interrogation of high-risk criminals. "Ma'am," he said quietly, but clearly, "you started this conflict with your preconceived judgments about a man you don't know at all. The only reason you've decided I don't belong in this place, on this plane, in this row, is the color of my skin. Nothing else." Karen recoiled as if she'd been struck. For a moment, something resembling shame flashed in her eyes, but it quickly disappeared under a new wave of indignation. "It's not true!" she exclaimed. "It's not about your race. It's about your behavior." "What kind of behavior?" Marcus said calmly. "Was it that I sat silently in my seat? Or the fact that I gave you the window seat without a single objection?" Several passengers who heard this exchange nodded approvingly. Journalist Richard Lee continued to take notes, his fingers moving rapidly across the screen of his smartphone. The airplane exited the turbulent zone, and after a few minutes the seatbelt indicator went out. Almost immediately afterward, Captain Thompson appeared in the cabin, his face serious and determined. "Miss Baker," he addressed Karen, "you wanted to see me?" Karen straightened up in her chair, gathering the remnants of her dignity. "Yes, Captain," she began in a formal tone. "I wish to make a formal complaint. This man," she pointed to Marcus, "is creating an intimidating atmosphere and making false accusations of racism. I do not feel safe and I demand action." Captain Thompson turned to Marcus. "Sir, have you said or done anything that could be construed as a threat?" Marcus shook his head. "No, sir. I merely pointed out the obvious fact that Miss Baker objected to my presence with her solely because of my race." "That's a lie," Karen shrieked. "I'm not a racist. I have black African Americans working for me. I donate money to charity." Her disclaimer did not go unnoticed. A murmur of disapproval ran through the cabin. Captain Thompson listened to both sides, then turned to the other passengers. "Could anyone corroborate either side's version of the story?" he asked. Hands went up almost simultaneously. An elderly couple across the aisle, a young mother with a child, a businessman in a strict suit, and, of course, Richard Lee. "This gentleman," the elderly man pointed to Marcus, "has behaved with exceptional courtesy and restraint despite his incessant provocations. She called him like you and said that people like him shouldn't be around business travelers," the young mother added. "My son heard everything, and I had to explain to him what racism means." Richard Lee picked up his cell phone. "I have an audio recording of the entire incident," he reported, "including Miss Baker's last comments about black knock," with an unfinished word. Karen's face went pale, then red with anger and humiliation. She turned to Captain Thompson, her eyes narrowed. "This is a conspiracy," she hissed. "They are all conspiring against me. I demand that you make a decision right now. Either he leaves this place, or I will file a complaint against your entire airline and start a lawsuit." Captain Thompson straightened, his gaze hard. "Miss Baker, based on the numerous pieces of evidence and your own behavior that I am observing right now, I am making a decision. You will be met by airport security upon landing in Cleveland. Violating the rules of conduct on board is a serious violation of aviation law." "You can't!" Karen shouted, rising from her seat. "You don't know who I am. My husband is a major shareholder in your company. You're all going to lose your jobs." Marcus watched this scene with the same calm that had accompanied him during the FBI's most intense operations. He saw the situation coming to a climax and knew he had to make a decision. At a moment when Karen was almost screaming, threatening everyone around her with lawsuits and dismissal, Marcus calmly pulled a small black leather wallet from the inside pocket of his jacket. In one smooth motion, he opened it, revealing a shiny gold FBI badge and a special agent identification card. There was instant silence in the cabin. Karen froze, half speaking, her mouth left ajar in mute surprise. Captain Thompson straightened even more, instinctively assuming an almost military stance. Diana Rodriguez covered her mouth with her hand. The passengers watching the situation looked as if someone had hit the pause button. "Special Agent Marcus Jenkins, Federal Bureau of Investigation," Marcus said in a calm, professional tone. "Captain Thompson, I apologize for the disturbance on your flight. I am returning to Washington after completing the Detroit operation and would prefer to avoid further escalation of the situation. Richard Lee, who until that moment had been quietly watching the developments, suddenly jumped up from his seat, his eyes widening with recognition. "Wait, Marcus Jenkins?" he said with undisguised excitement. The same Marcus Jenkins who had led the operation to capture the Detroit Ripper? The man who had tracked down the most elusive serial killer in Michigan history? Now all eyes shifted from the FBI ID to Marcus's face. His reserved expression hadn't changed a bit, but there was a flicker of distaste in his eyes. He'd never liked public attention. "I was part of a larger team," he answered modestly. "It was a team effort of many agents and local law enforcement. But it was you who developed the psychological profile that led to his identification," Richard persisted. "It was your analysis that allowed you to predict his next move and organize a successful capture without a single casualty. I wrote about this case for the Detroit Times." An excited whisper ran through the cabin. The Detroit Ripper was a name every Michigan resident knew. The serial killer who had held the entire state in fear for over 3 years had been caught just 2 weeks ago in a carefully planned FBI operation. News of his arrest had been front-page news. Karen Baker sat frozen-faced, her gaze darting between the FBI badge, Marcus's face, and the excited reporter. Slowly, the realization of the situation began to creep into her mind. She hadn't just insulted a random black man, she had publicly humiliated and blamed a national hero, a man who had risked his life to catch one of the most dangerous criminals of recent years. "Yeah, I didn't know," she mumbled, her voice suddenly quiet and unsure. "Of course you didn't know," Marcus replied, removing his badge. "You didn't know anything about me except the color of my skin, and based on that alone, you decided I wasn't worthy of sitting next to you." Captain Thompson cleared his throat, bringing his attention back to himself. "Agent Jenkins, on behalf of our airline, I sincerely apologize for this incident. Of course, Miss Baker will be disembarked in Cleveland, and we will take steps to ensure that something like this does not happen again." Marcus nodded. "I appreciate your professionalism, Captain, and the professionalism of your crew." He cast an appreciative glance at Diana, who still looked shocked by the discovery. Karen sat shrunken in her chair, her former self-confidence completely gone. She stared straight ahead of her, avoiding meeting anyone's gaze. Her hands trembled slightly as she tried to fix her hair, a gesture that suggested extreme nervousness. "Agent Jenkins," Richard Lee asked, unable to pass up a journalistic opportunity, "could you give a brief comment on the completion of the operation to capture the Detroit Ripper?" Marcus shook his head politely. "All official commentary is provided by the FBI press office. I am off duty at the moment and would prefer to refrain from discussing the details of the operation." Karen rose suddenly from her seat, her movements abrupt and awkward. "Yeah, I need to use the restroom," she mumbled, trying to squeeze past Marcus. Diana took a step forward. "Miss Baker, please wait for the captain to finish talking." "No, I have to. I don't feel well," Karen insisted, her face actually taking on a sickly hue. Marcus stood up, allowing her to pass. As she passed, he noticed that her eyes glistened with unshed tears, a mixture of shame, humiliation, and the realization of the seriousness of her actions had finally caught up with her. "Ma'am," Marcus said quietly, so that only she could hear, "it's not what mistakes we make that matters, but how we react to them and what we learn from the experience." Karen froze for a moment, then nodded quickly and hurried toward the restroom at the end of the cabin, her head low, avoiding meeting the eyes of the other passengers. Captain Thompson escorted her out with a glance, then turned to Marcus. "Agent Jenkins, we'll be landing in Cleveland in 40 minutes. Security will be ready to receive Miss Baker." "Thank you, Captain," Marcus replied. "I appreciate your determination in this situation." Richard Lee returned to his seat, but not before handing Marcus his business card. "If you ever want to talk about your work or what African-American FBI agents face, I'd love to write about it," he said. "Society needs to know about situations like this and the people who, despite prejudice, continue to protect all of us." Marcus took the card with a slight smile, the first one he'd had all that long day. "Maybe someday," he replied. "Right now, I just want to get to Washington and get some sleep." As Captain Thompson returned to the cockpit and Diana began preparing for a quick landing, the passengers around Marcus began to talk quietly, casting admiring glances at him. Some even dared to approach to thank him for his service or to express support after an unpleasant incident. Marcus accepted these signs of attention with his usual restraint, but it was noticeable that this reaction was unusual and a little uncomfortable for him. For most of his career, he had worked discreetly, avoiding publicity, concentrating on doing his duty without a lot of fuss. After a while, Karen returned from the restroom. Her face was pale but calm, the traces of makeup carefully wiped away as if she had tried to wash away not only her mascara, but also her recent behavior. She quietly took her seat, careful not to disturb Marcus, who was now immersed in reading documents from his folder. The remaining time before landing in Cleveland passed in tense silence. Only once did Karen break it, quietly saying, "I apologize. Sincerely, what I did was unforgivable." Marcus pulled away from the papers and looked at her intently. His penetrating gaze, honed by years of interrogation and analysis of criminal behavior, studied her face, trying to determine the sincerity of her words. "Accepted," he finally replied. "I hope this experience will be a valuable lesson to you." "It already has," she replied quietly, lowering her gaze. As the plane began its descent over Cleveland, Diana approached their row. "Miss Baker, please prepare to disembark. Airport security representatives will be waiting for you at the gate." Karen nodded silently. Her former arrogance was completely gone, replaced by the quiet resignation of someone who had realized the seriousness of her mistakes. After a soft landing and shutting down the engines, Diana escorted Karen to the exit, where 2 security officers were waiting. Surprisingly, Karen didn't make another scene. She silently gathered her things and followed the staff, only turning around at the last moment to meet Marcus's gaze. That look read a mixture of remorse, shame, and perhaps the beginnings of understanding. When the plane took off again, heading for Washington, Richard Lee took the seat next to Marcus. "You know," the journalist said, looking out the window thoughtfully, "I have a gift for finding good stories, but I never expected to witness such a powerful demonstration of both the problem and the hope of our society on one short flight from Detroit." Marcus smiled, this time genuinely, without a trace of the fatigue that had haunted him all day. "Sometimes the most important lessons are learned at 10,000 feet, he said. "Where the air is cleaner and the Earth's problems seem smaller, you can see better what really matters." Richard nodded, making a note in his notebook. He knew he had in his hands a story not just about racism on board an airplane, but about human dignity, professionalism, and the possibility of redemption for even those who make the most unsightly mistakes. A month after the incident, the Detroit Times published an extensive article by Richard Lee about the problems of racism in everyday life. The story of Marcus Jenkins became the centerpiece of the piece, although Karen Baker's name was changed for ethical reasons. Marcus was promoted and transferred to a special FBI unit profiling serial criminals. His work methods and quiet determination became an example to many young agents. Karen Baker went through a major reassessment of her views. Not only did she lose her job after the incident, but she also faced public condemnation when a video of the incident appeared on social media. She later volunteered for an organization fighting racial discrimination, trying to redeem herself with concrete actions. Diana Rodriguez was recognized by airline management for her professional behavior in a difficult situation. She often told this story to new flight attendants as an example of the importance of remaining calm and principled. Captain Michael Thompson continued to fly for 2 more years before taking a well-deserved retirement. On his last flight, he gave a speech on the importance of mutual respect, not only in the air, but on the ground as well. And high above the clouds, airplanes continued to fly in which people of different races, nationalities, and beliefs sat side by side, sharing common space and sometimes common stories that could change their lives and views forever.